Global hunger has hit a new high. The United Nations says that nearly 300 million people faced acute hunger last year. And the outlook for 2025 is bleak due to wars and cuts in aid. So which countries are experiencing the worst of the global food crisis, and who are the most vulnerable? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. A world dangerously off course. The stark warning from the United Nations after finding that more than 295 million people faced acute hunger in 2024. And fears are growing for its future as major donor countries reduce funding this year. Climate change and economic crises affected 96 million people and 18 countries, including Syria and Yemen. And conflict and violence are the leading cause of the world's largest humanitarian crisis in Sudan, after 2 years of civil war there. In Gaza, Israel's blockade of all food, water and medicine has entered a third month, creating a manufactured crisis. So is global food hunger a failure of systems or a failure of humanity? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, our report from Barbara Angopa.
A UN report says conflict is driving catastrophic hunger around the world, but particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. That includes Gaza, where Israel has intensified airstrikes since it pulled out of a ceasefire in March. Famine was averted in the Strip in March last year after humanitarian aid was scaled up. But many Palestinians are now facing increased hardship and starvation as a result of Israel's blockade that's prevented food and water from entering for more than 2 months.
Our only hope is that Donald Trump's visit to the Middle East would result in solutions and somehow opens crossings to bring any humanitarian assistance as soon as possible into the Gaza Strip. But the visit is over and not a drop of water or bread into Gaza. The suffering we are experiencing today has not been experienced by anyone in the world or by Arabs.
The report says the number of people facing acute food insecurity globally almost tripled in 2024. Close to 300 million people were affected. Conflicts in Gaza, South Sudan, Haiti and Mali pushed families to the edge of starvation. Sudan confirmed famine-like conditions in the Zamzam refugee camp in June last year. Economic shocks, including the devaluation of currencies, pulled millions of people into food crises in 15 countries, including Syria and Yemen. And extreme weather, particularly floods and droughts caused by the El Niño weather phenomenon, created so-called food shocks in southern Africa, southern Asia and the Horn of Africa. Back in Gaza, the report says Palestinians could be facing famine by September because of the Israeli blockade.
In Gaza, the situation of Palestinians is beyond description, beyond atrocious, and beyond inhumane. A policy of siege and starvation makes a mockery of international law. The blockade against humanitarian aid must end immediately.
The UN warned the world outlook for 2025 is bleak after major donor countries reduced funding for humanitarian aid. The US also abruptly terminated foreign aid spending when it dissolved USAID, and other countries are also reducing contributions. Barbara Angopa for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Gunness is the former Director of Communications at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine and the Near East. He joins us from London. Elise Nalbandian is a regional advocacy and campaign manager for Oxfam in Africa. She joins us from Nairobi. And Sarah Hayat is a climate change law and policy specialist. She joins us from Lahore. Warm welcome to you all. Chris, let's start with you. As the executive director of UNICEF says, in a world of plenty, there's no excuse for children to go hungry or die of malnutrition. How, Chris, in 2025, can nearly 300 million people be facing acute hunger and food insecurity?
Well, let's be clear. The main drivers of hunger and starvation are climate change and conflict, and both of those are man-made. Both of those could be stopped and slowed immediately if the political will existed. And the simple answer to your question, Adrian, is why? It's because there is no political will to stop these things. There needs to be political will. The masses out there look at these figures and are horrified. The politicians are doing very, very little about it. Gaza is no exception, by the way.
Elise, as the Secretary-General said, hunger in the 21st century is indefensible. We cannot respond to empty stomachs with empty hands and turned backs. Bearing in mind what Chris has just said, to what extent do most of us who do have enough to eat simply don't care enough to make our governments do something about it? How much of this is the fault of the likes of you and I?
I mean, it is a sobering question, because to a certain extent, just how far can we push our governments is a question we should be asking ourselves. We should be demanding more global action. Those of us from the global south who come from countries where hunger is a problem, I myself am from Ethiopia, how much can we ask our own governments in places like Africa to actually do more for us? And in that case, generally speaking, you have to realize it's a very long-term investment of work on each person's side. You cannot give up because you asked for one change and it didn't happen. You need to put in years of work. And we have seen improvements. Over 10 years, over 15 years, systems have improved because civil society groups and communities have asked for improvement. And the people like us should be asking for more, and we should be consistent, and we should be doing it over a long period of time.
But it's not, at least then, something that you can just throw money at. Is this a failure of systems and funding, or, as the Secretary-General said, a failure of humanity?
In my opinion, it's slightly both. Money helps. We need money. That's always true. But there's also a slight failure of humanity where we tend to say, well, hunger doesn't affect me, so why should I do anything about it? Or, it's not happening here, or it's not happening there, so it doesn't concern me. But at the end of the day, if all of us are not thriving, then none of us are thriving. So it is actually a failure of systems. It is a failure of humanity that somehow in parts of the world, we talk about huge numbers of people going hungry. And it's a sort of, it's sort of statistics. We're not actually dealing with the concept that each person who's going hungry is a person like you and I. We're actually saying millions, 55 million in East Africa, 27.7 million in DRC, 24.6 million in Sudan. These are not just millions. These are individuals. These are human beings like you and I. They're just very unlucky to be part of that 24 million, 27 million, or whichever million we're talking about.
Sarah, the numbers are staggering. To what extent are hunger and malnutrition, for whatever reason, spreading faster than the world can respond?
Definitely, hunger and malnutrition are interlinked, spreading faster than we can respond. But it's not that we can't respond. I think for the most part, there always seems to be something else that's important, that's more important. Especially in the global south, I think this is a prevalent theme where there's always like there's political instability, or there is war or conflict, or, for example, in the last week itself, the India and Pakistan, the conflict, the threats to curtail water supply, or rather cut down water supply towards Pakistan. I think it just seems like there is always something else on the agenda, and hunger and malnutrition and agricultural and the support that all of this requires tends to go on the back burner. But that said, we can definitely do something about it. I think we can definitely invest in it. There's research that can be done. The global north can pool in money to the global south. We can have, the private sector can contribute, NGOs, the government, there can be collaborations. Early warning systems can be set for when needed. In Pakistan, flooding or natural disasters almost always provide like the greatest hiccup to economic stability and for food security. Like in 2022, we out of the 30.1 billion USD in losses, almost 12.9 billion were because of agricultural losses, and then the ripple down effect of food insecurity that stemmed. It's still ongoing. Land just doesn't recover. People don't recover the next day.
Sorry, you talk about the situation in Pakistan in particular. The world has been warned for some time now that the climate is changing and that the poorest will be most vulnerable to its effect. Should anything have been done to head off this crisis?
Well, I think we're a little late to discuss that, to discuss whether we could have reversed or prevented climate change. The focus now should primarily be on adapting to it, dealing with it, and at least that's my personal opinion. Mitigation and adaptive measures should be at the forefront, especially for the global south adaptation. And I feel that the reason we are so direly affected by food insecurity in the global south is because of our reliance on agriculture. And agriculture in the global south, I would like to say, is a generic term that would encompass both livestock rearing and aquatic farming, so fisheries as well.
Chris, let's talk for a moment about Gaza, given that conflict is a major driver of food insecurity. In Gaza, Israel's blockade of food, water and medicine continues. As we said at the beginning of the programme, Israel is accused of using starvation as a weapon of war. Why has the international community stood by and allowed this to happen?
Well, Israel is peddling again the mother of all lies, and that is that it needs to blockade Gaza totally, it's now going into its third month, in order to stop Hamas stealing aid. And the world simply must not believe that. It's ludicrous. Do they really think that Hamas is going to eat the chemo tablets intended for children with cancer? Do they really think Hamas will drink the insulin that's there for diabetic children? No, the children are dying because of that. Do they really think that Hamas are going to eat the pummy nut that's there for malnourished children, the therapeutic? And let's be clear, 150 children are being born every day in Gaza. Women are having cesarean sections without any anaesthetic. I mean, all mothers in the world listening to that fact should be absolutely horrified. All first ladies, by the way, listening to that fact should be absolutely horrified. Of course, we know where Hamas's money has come from. It came through Israel. Tens of millions of dollars were allowed in by Netanyahu himself. So the idea that this man is saying he's worried about Hamas getting money or aid or siphoning off international humanitarian assistance is ludicrous, coming from the man who was the person who let all the money into Gaza. And now they're reinventing this newly minted aid organization, allowing people, the military, cynically to weaponize aid in support of their genocidal policies of ethnic cleansing, of starvation. And when I hear you ask the other guests, what should the world do? In the case of Gaza, it's very simple. The International Court of Justice has ruled that the occupation of Palestine, which includes the blockade of Gaza, is illegal, and that no state, no member state of the UN can do anything to be complicit. And when Philippe Sand, the great British jurisprudential expert, stood up in the ICJ, in the court, the Supreme Court of the world, and made his deposition, he said there should be no military support for Israel, no financial support, no economic support, no diplomatic support, no nothing is what he said. So that is what governments can do. It's not about planning, it's not about climate change, it's about not believing Israel's mother of all lies and actually sanctioning Israel, and doing it now, because the ICJ has said that this occupation must end as quickly as possible. Governments know precisely what we have to do.
But Chris, I'll come back to the original question. Why is the rest of the world standing by and allowing Israel to do this? Why hasn't anyone done anything when we're seeing these pictures of people dying of starvation coming out of Gaza every day?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people are believing the mother of all lies, which is that Israel needs to impose this blockade because it wants to defeat Hamas. That, of course, is not true, and it's also impossible. And I think that, frankly, world governments are frightened of the powerful state lobbying system that Israel has set up around the world. Politicians are frightened to speak up because they think they're going to lose their campaign funding. They're going to be accused of anti-Semitism, which, of course, is being weaponized in the cause of genocide. There are many political reasons. And, someone who's done public advocacy for decades now, I've seen the way that these people work. Israel and its very powerful groups around the world makes it very, very difficult for politicians to speak out and do the right thing. But as you say, we're now seeing babies starving to death on our television, live streamed every day. And all of those excuses, they're no longer valid. We need to find, what is Keir Starmer's, what is Keir Starmer going to say to his children when they ask, Daddy, there was a starvation going on your watch. You could have stopped it. What did you do? David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, what is he going to say to his children when they say, Daddy, what did you do when you could have stopped the starvation? So, we have to prick the consciences of specific people. It would take perhaps 50 politicians on our planet to lift this barbaric, genocidal siege on Gaza. 50 politicians could make the decision to end starvation in Gaza now. But to be clear, starvation is a bit like a locomotive. You can put your foot on the brakes immediately, but the locomotive will carry on down the track. So starvation will continue even if they lifted the blockade immediately. And when I hear your other guests talk about money, Gaza doesn't need money. The Palestinians don't need money. If they were allowed to trade, they would feed themselves in a heartbeat. So, Gaza should not be aid dependent. It shouldn't be on any kind of aid dependent system. What we need to do is lift all of the crossings into Gaza for commercial trade, both in and out. We shouldn't be talking about aid and starvation in Gaza. It could be one of the most successful economies on the Mediterranean.
Elise, I don't know whether you want to come back on that, but as we said, conflict being a major driver of food insecurity, to what extent is that beyond the control of aid organizations like yours and the international community, leaving Gaza aside for a moment, which is a very different case?
Conflict is a huge driver of hunger in Africa. Last year, I had calculated that 70% of the hunger caseload in Africa was, in fact, in conflict zones. So climate change is also a man-made cause, and climate change also feeds conflict. So you cannot really separate out one cause from the other. Hunger is not natural. It is man-made. It is a political choice, and it is a political choice made by the world. And money can help rebuild systems, but money is also needed to help address systemic deficiencies in food systems. Food systems are extremely dysfunctional. The agriculture adaptation has not been done in time. When conflict starts, fertile grounds don't get used. We lose hectares, thousands of hectares worth of crops in the first year, and then in the second year, there's no planting anyway. Farmers go to war, and animals are killed, and food systems are damaged very early on in the conflict, and then the hunger grows and grows and grows, and as hunger grows, people become displaced, and they go to places where there are no food systems, there are no marketplaces, but they can start the marketplaces if they're given the tools to do so. But humanitarian aid is not designed for longer-term assistance. So generally speaking, there is a political will issue that we need to address, whereby when we're investing all this money and you're imagining aid is sacks of flour given to people and there's no water, what's the point of the flour? How can they eat it? Okay. Why couldn't you give them seeds and tools instead, or fertilizer? Is the ground they're on fertile enough? Is there water that they can farm with? Can you give them animals instead? So all of these questions we need to ask. And the fact is, humanitarian aid is not designed to ask this question.
Elise, one bright spot in this report was that Kenya has seen an improvement in its security outlook, its food security outlook. What's been done there to improve things in the worst affected areas?
Well, first of all, there was actually a natural improvement in the sense that the 2024 rains were sufficient. So this actually helped the agro-pastoralists bounce back. So some of the hunger in Kenya was due to climate change. It was about extreme weather. We had that very long drought between 2020 and 2023. And that ended. And in 2024, we saw the number drastically reduced from 4.4 million people in IPC 3+ situations to this year 2.8 million, which, by the way, is still too high. There was also the government social programs, which were very useful. 500,000 households received cash transfers in arid regions, which was a lifesaver. They could invest it as they saw fit. Cash is good for that. But there's a risk. Let's not celebrate too soon. 2.8 is high, and there's a big risk of backsliding because drought in this region, in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, parts of Somalia, is actually common. It will come back, and the risk for backsliding is massive. And Kenya last year had a massive funding gap. Still, it didn't address all it needed to address. Then there was the El Nino aftermath. There was massive floods in the country, and 20,000 farms were damaged right after the droughts. So what happened is we saw results which we were hoping the rains would help, but the floods coming meant that we actually didn't see the level of improvement we wanted to see. And of course, there's the debt crisis. 27% of Kenya's revenue is spent on debt repayment externally. And this limits social spending in the country. And external debt is a massive problem for a lot of African countries. So while I can tell you some good stories from Somalia. I can tell you how Ethiopia's hunger situation has also improved. But the reality is we're all in the same situation where the risk of backsliding is very real.
Sarah, with countries reducing their foreign aid spending at a time when it's needed most, with funding basically unable to be relied upon in the near future, what can be done to make sure that communities are more resilient to food security shocks, whatever causes them?
That's a good question, and I wish I had a more nuanced answer to this, except that I think I'll have to go back to my earlier answer where I strongly feel that with countries that don't have the kind of funding that they deserve and that they need, like most countries in the global south, adaptive capacity has to be built, and that requires some climate smart agriculture, developing drought resilient seeds that can grow in high temperatures, in saline water. What we need is capacity building. We need farmers who will who know how to operate machinery that will help them in extreme weather conditions, in times of conflict, because climate change itself is a sort of conflict. I think that's a theme that's been reiterated in this program. I think what we should be doing is we should be focusing on diversifying means of livelihood. For example, and I can speak for Pakistan here, that for most women in rural areas, agriculture, including livestock rearing and aquatic farming, is pretty much the only source of livelihood. And with climate change affecting that, the household income decreases substantially and they can't afford food. And conflict arises, domestic conflict arises, social conflict arises. It leads to migration, climate-induced migration, domestic migration, which in itself sort of fuels conflict at some level. So what really needs to be done then is just improved adaptive capacity, work on strengthening institutions, domestic institutions, enforcing laws and policies. I feel like now there has been enough awareness within countries to have laws and policies. They can always be improved, but what's really needed in the global south is actually the implementation. I think what really needs to be done is to ensure that external conflict, wars, threats of war, threats of cutting down water supply, these need to be sort of put aside. And the focus should be on sort of helping those who really need it.
Chris, is there any reason for optimism here? If you can't get countries to step in and halt what's happening right now in Gaza, what is the hope of getting them to remain committed to international aid? Is this current climate of isolationism that we're seeing in the world going to kill people in the developing world? To what extent is food insecurity going to become worse?
There is one shred of optimism in relation to Gaza specifically, and that is the world has the solutions in its hands. We have the International Court of Justice ruling that says that complicity in this illegal behavior, this genocide of choice, must stop. So if the world wanted to do something about it, it could do that. It could blockade Israel. It could impose sanctions on Israel until this barbaric, medieval, genocidal siege ends. But I think the other thing to say is it breaks my heart to hear Gaza being discussed in the same breath as sub-Saharan Africa, because the kind of solutions which are absolutely vitally important, as your guests have been saying, but those solutions do not really apply to Gaza, because what is happening in Gaza is happening to a place which could be one of the most successful economies on the planet. So, there has to be a proper implementation of the ICJ decision on Israel. There are provisional measures also in the genocide case that the starvation has to end immediately. But I would also add that as far as Gaza is concerned, we know what has to happen. It can happen if the world gets on the right side of the rule of law, if it implements these decisions by the world's highest court. They need to be able to trade. We need to open all the crossings for commerce. Gaza will stand on its own 2 feet. The Palestinians do not want to be aid dependent, and there's no reason why they should.
And there, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us today. Chris Gunness, Elise Nalbandian and Sarah Hayat. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.